Okay, so here we go. So here is my outline. And I should say, this is completely based on the Shifting Concepts paper, and that I circulated also as a manuscript in advance. I didn't know when the book was coming out, and so apologies if you have already. I mean, who would have read it in 10 days? But anyway, this is basically based on that paper. So I'm going to start by saying a little bit about the background project that I'm involved with in social political philosophy. I'm going to elaborate a bit on how language and thought interact with politics. Then I'm going to introduce a particular approach to concepts. I think it's a good approach to concepts, but I don't really feel as though I can, in the context of this talk, sort of defeat all other conceptions of concepts or argue, conclusively for this conception. So I'm sure there are other ways that are also, I'm a pluralist about most things. So I think for different purposes, different approaches to concepts might be better. I'm going to then consider different forms of conceptual amelioration, both epistemic and semantic. And then I'm going to consider the problem, but wait a minute, because on my view, content isn't essential to a concept. And so address that and do so thinking about how concepts function in social systems, and then I'll draw the conclusion. Okay, so let's go. So in my recent work, I've argued that to understand the phenomenon of oppression, we need to better understand human embeddedness in social practices. So I'm going to spend a second talking about social practices and how I think they work. So social practices are sites of socially organized agency in response to a resource, or sometimes I call it a source, because it could have either plus or minus value, either be good for us or bad for us. Where's the clicker here? I'll go back again. So the practices depend on there being public schemas or social meanings that we rely on for communication and signaling. Culture, or what my technical term is a cultural techne, provides a toolbox of scripts, meanings, background, default assumptions, etc., that are constantly being altered, repurposed, discarded, and contested. And a cultural techne is a mechanism for the distribution of power and resources, because our options for agency are both limited by both what the symbolic and material resources the local practices make available. I'm going to say a little bit, I'm going to give you more examples in a second. Hegemonic social practices become part of the local geography. They are a given around which we structure our lives. Some individuals live in inhospitable social terrain, and others of us live in fertile valleys. So here's a picture that I like to use. Here we are, we're all trying to organize ourselves and coordinate and get things done, etc. And here's the way the picture works. There are social meanings, and there are the stuff in the world. Though the stuff in the world doesn't have to be always concrete. It can be time, it can be knowledge, it can be, things that are fairly abstract. And what happens is that we have collective meetings. This is the cultural techne. Is this bunny a pet? Is it food? Is it a pelt or a potential pelt? How do we interpret this bit of the world, the resource? And the cultural techne provides us, as we are socialized and as we become fluent in our social milieu, it provides a kind of filtering mechanism that allows us to see certain things and not others, that makes certain things salient and not others. It sort of helps us remember certain things and not others. It facilitates certain kinds of inferences. And so these meanings are internalized, but they're internalized not just in a single individual, but in us collectively, because they are how we get along. And then through that filtering process, we have information that enables us to form attitudes that then motivate our action. And so if, for example, bunnies around here are pets, then we're going to try and cuddle them and feed them and treat them nicely, etc. And then they become very docile and they're not afraid of us, and that reinforces the social meanings. If around here we consider them food, then that's going to see when we see a bunny, then there's a potential food and we're going to be much more aggressive toward it, potentially kill it, etc. And then that reinforces the idea that they're not pets because they become afraid of us, they bite us when we get near them, etc., etc. So there's a kind of looping effect that, that practices enable. We change the world to correspond to the social meanings that are dominant in the milieu. Okay, so this area of social meanings is what I'm going to be interested in today. And on my view, when the social meanings sort of organize us in ways that are unjust or fail to enable us to appreciate the value of things, then it's ideology. So I would say that a set of social meanings that treats bunnies as food is problematic, right? I'm a vegetarian. I think that we shouldn't be eating bunnies. I mean, maybe if you're, have nothing else after the apocalypse and there's, bunnies around, that I'm not going to worry about that. But in ordinary circumstances, to treat a bunny as food is a bad and ideological cultural techne. Okay, but not all technes are ideological, on my view. So in response to oppression or injustice, we must collectively change the existing social structures. And of course, that requires more than thinking differently. We need material change, we need political change, we need all kinds of change. But today I'm going to focus on the project of challenging a cultural techne, specifically the conceptual and symbolic tools it affords. And one way of doing this is through conceptual amelioration. So recently, I've argued that one form of conceptual amelioration is epistemic and another is semantic. So I did this both in the Kaplan book, Going On Not in the Same Way. I mentioned this, and I've also mentioned it in the context of the Shifting Concepts paper. But I think there's still more that needs to be done to illuminate and defend this possible distinction. So here I'm going to review the distinction and argue that at least one form of semantic amelioration on functional grounds, is coherent and sometimes valuable. So Kaplan's book argues that this is ridiculous, and so I feel some obligation to be responsive to that. I should also note that I'm just going through my handout, so if you've downloaded the handout and you're looking at the handout, you can just read along if the PowerPoint is distracting. I'm not going to discuss in this talk how to distinguish an improvement as opposed to merely a change. I talk about amelioration, it makes it seem like it's better. There are moral considerations that are important here. I have a paper on my website. It's called Political Epistemology and Social Critique under Research. And that's a place where I try to go into more deeply how you can distinguish genuine amelioration where you've got something better as opposed to a mere change. Okay, so language, thought, and politics. So why is it so important? Okay, so how should we understand social change? Much social change is triggered by natural disasters, wars, migrations, pandemics, technological advances, economic booms and busts. But some occurs because the conceptual or symbolic frame for coordination changes. And there are a lot of reasons why this can happen. A movie can do it, a novel can do it, the development of a meme like Black Lives Matter can do it. So there's going to be a significance of conceptual and symbolic frames. It makes certain phenomena more salient than others. So in any case, I think material and cultural change go hand in hand. So the focus today on conceptual or symbolic frames is not to deny the significance of the material. But what is the process of cultural change or a change in symbolic and conceptual resources involves? What are we doing when we come to understand that race is not a biological kind, but a social construct? Do we change what it is to be married when we recognize same-sex marriage? Have we replaced our old concept of marriage or our old concept of race with a new one? Or has our understanding simply evolved? Now, it can be important for activists to insist that we're not simply undermining old practices and replacing them with new ones, right? That's It may in some sense be what we're doing, but that's not politically the best route very often. Because, for example, in the movement for marriage equality, same-sex marriages are marriages as legitimate as any ever were. So we're not just saying, oh, we're giving up on marriage and we're just pretending this is marriage. It's not pretending that this is marriage. This is just as legitimate as marriage as any marriage has been. Moreover, we should interpret our history as continuous with our current conditions. So race has been constructed over centuries with cultural tools that deflected attention from social reality. It's still happening today. So the tool of biological race was a conceptual tool to deflect us from what was really happening historically, that race was being constructed through, social stratification and hierarchy. And we were being deflected from noticing that by the ideology that race is biological. And so what we have to do is understand that we are continuous with what was happening when people were using the concept of race before. It is sometimes difficult to defend the idea that we're not simply discarding our old ways and imposing something new. And I believe that that philosophy can hinder us significantly. If it's part of what marriage means, that it's between one man and one woman, and philosophers have defended this in court, certain philosophers, that this is what it means to be married, then it would seem that same-sex marriage does involve a replacement of our concept. We've destroyed marriage and replaced it with something we pretend is marriage. Or because race isn't biological, we really should be colorblind, and so ignore the cultural hierarchy and the social hierarchy that has been going on for centuries. Colorblindness, right? Because it's like witch, there is no such thing, so why are we pretending there is? Or if woman just means adult human female, then trans women are not women. So this strategy of philosophers saying, I can tell you what the meaning of this is, and we should stick with the meaning because you politically correct people are just trying to pretend that we're still living the same way or carrying on with our culture. I think that this is a political tool that we need to resist. So can we develop a philosophically viable account of concepts that enables us to talk about the continuity? Okay, one approach to concepts. So I'm going to work with an externalist framework, and on this approach, we express beliefs, oppose, etc. propositions, and propositions should be understood in terms of informational or intentional content, as Bob Solnecker says, as truth conditions, functions from possible circumstances of truth values, or as sets of possible situations. So I'm embedded in this externalist framework in my workplace. This is taken back common ground. It's part of the background. And so I'm really thinking within this context of theoretical frame for content and concepts. So how should we understand concepts on a view of this sort? Let's start with the idea that the informational content of a concept is a partition of possible individuals. A partition of possible dogs is just all the actual and possible dogs, the flurry, slobbery, barky ones in our lives, plus the ones that have existed, will exist, and ones we can only imagine. More specifically, the content of a concept is a partition of logical space. The content of a concept dog will be a function from a world to a set of individuals in that world. Okay, so conceptual content, for an individual to possess in the most minimal sense a concept of X, is to have a cluster of capacities that enables them to possess information about X's. So possessing a concept is a matter of having dispositions toward a space of possibilia. So a concept is not a thing in the head. It's not a mental particular as I'm understanding it. It's a set of dispositions towards logical space, a set of dispositions to make sense of a partition. And so both a vet and a child has dispositions toward the division in logical space between dogs and all the rest of the stuff, which is, of course, beautiful, but anyway, not dogs. So how should we think? Let's think a little bit more about the concept of, or about the idea of possession. We all have access to partitions of logical space through different modalities, from different vantage points, and at different levels of granularity. From a psychological point of view, possession of the concept may occur by virtue of different cognitive mechanisms and give rise to different dispositions in different individuals. So that capacity that you have to partition logical space, that capacity can involve different mechanisms, it can involve different sorts of dispositions, and some of them more fine-grained than others. Conceptual skill comes in different forms and degrees. So we may share the concept of X. We both have the capacities to process information about X's. Sorry, there's a typo. Have the capacities to process information about X's. But we differ in how refined or idiosyncratic our capacities are. We can say then that different individuals who share the concept of X form different conceptions of X. And I'll get a picture for you in a minute. Sharing concepts, however, is crucial for coordination and communication. They marshal and organize our capacities for attention, categorization, interpretation, memory, language, inference, affect, and the like, and for coordinating with others in response to particular kinds of information. So this role for concepts, right, there they are. They're right. Remember the cultural techne? The cultural techne, the social meanings, are what we rely on in order to both easily focus on the same thing when someone is pointing, or have a paradigm in mind when we use a particular word, something like that. The role of sharing concepts and organizing us in our practices requires a kind of standardization of what counts as an adequate appreciation of X's for the purposes at hand. So I'd like to say that to be conversant with the concept of X in a context C, one must be able to process a subset of information about X's that is socially approved in C. And hopefully it's going to be the approved ones are going to be the ones that give us the specific information. They focus on the specific information that is important for that context. So those who are conversant with a concept and a context have an approved orientation that privileges certain exemplars, features, responses, experiences, inferences, and subcategories. A vet and a child, they both possess the same concept of dog, but the vet can take the orientation of veterinary medicine and will be conversant with dog in contexts that call for that orientation. So the child and the vet can draw distinctions in logical space between dogs and not dogs, but the orientation of the vet is much more fine-grained. It's much more responsive to features of dogs that the child's orientation is not. So we sometimes introduce even different words to pick out the same partition of logical space. For example, vets might use the term canis familiaris in certain contexts, reflecting that context of inquiry. Okay, so what I'd like to suggest is here you have the possible dogs and possible non-dogs, and both the vet and the child can more or less, you know, they're going to be difficult cases when you see certain kinds of science fiction movies and you can't tell whether it's a dog or a wolf or an alien animal or something. I'll get to that. You're not going to be able to, you know, exactly tell which side of that line it's on, but for the most purposes, the vet and the child can draw that distinction between dogs and non-dogs. But there's going to be a difference in the granularity. So these lines are going to indicate that there's, in this partition of logical space, there's subdivisions that are going to be important. And so the vet may have a capacity to draw very fine-grained subdivisions in that partition of logical space that the child can't do. And remember, an approved orientation privileges certain exemplars, etc., and a certain attitude. So where a dog may, a child may be horrified at what a vet does to a dog, the affective response that a child has in response to what the vet can see and respond to is perfectly reasonable. Okay, so as I mentioned, we sometimes introduce different words to pick out the same partition of logical space for different purposes. And Seth Yalson makes this point with respect to the distinction between water and H2O. Yalson, another MIT. So in this world of Stalnackerian, broadly speaking, semantics. So Seth says, for example, the former water concept might, inter alia, be understood as embedding the partition into a subject matter reflecting parochial human interests and concerns, one including, say, the subject matter of beverages. So that with the concept water, we, inter alia, locate that stuff amongst the beverages. While the latter, H2O, embeds it in some part of the subject matter of chemistry. So with the concept of H2O, we, again, inter alia, locate that stuff amongst the chemicals. So I think it's a little bit weird to put, water amongst the beverages, and that water can be ice or, steam. So let's just say the stuff when in liquid form is amongst the beverages, allowing for that. So what Seth wants to say is the subject matter is plausibly delimited by a set of questions that arise in inquiry, but also in relation to our practical concerns. So when you want to say, is there something to drink around here? Someone's not unlikely to say, oh yeah, there's H2O coming out of the tap. They're going to say there's water coming out of the tap, or they'll give you something that is predominantly water, but not pure water, something like that. And so the notion of water is going to be situated in the subject matter. Is there something to drink around here? Or here's someone who's dying of thirst. Can we give them something? Yes, give them some water, et cetera, et cetera. But H2O is going to be embedded in the subject matter of chemistry. So here you have water and H2O, the subject matter for most purposes of beverages and chemicals they overlap in the extent to which water and H2O are the same name for these two things, but are located in different subject matters. Okay, so if we want to reify an orientation, so some people think, what the hell is an orientation? I still don't know what you're doing. So this is just for the metaphysicians out there, being a metaphysician myself. It might be thought of as a temporally extended abstract particular that is the evolving cluster of socially approved epistemic, affective, and agential responses to a privileged subset of information. So if you think about rituals like the ritual of marriage or the ritual of baptism or the ritual of graduation, these evolve over time, right? And there are certain things that we take to be part of it at some times because they're standardly approved to be part of the ritual, but it's a kind of temporally extended abstract thing that evolves and changes as time goes on. And similarly, these orientations, as we learn more about the world, as we have to navigate different kind of social coordination, these orientations will also evolve. The veterinary orientation privileges the distinction between sick and healthy, non-human animals, and requires epistemic and affective responses that guide the exercise of agency in that context. But the child doesn't need to have that distinction between sick and healthy non-human animals. Fluency in an orientation can also involve being conversant with a broad range of signaling mechanisms and social meanings employed in the context. So, for example, I think the concept of pink has the color pink as its informational content. I'm not going to try and say what that involves. It's controversial, but let's just say, yes, there's an informational content. But to be conversant with pink in some contexts requires responses linked to femininity, the use of the feminine pronoun, etc. So if you come across a stroller with a baby in it who's completely no gender markings as far as you can tell, but a little pink bow, then to say, how old is your daughter, et cetera, et cetera. That's being conversant with the color pink in our contemporary context. So my focus as we go forward is going to be on concepts understood as a public resource for coordination, and so on orientations rather than individual conceptions. So I'm not interested in psychology so much as I'm interested in kind of social meaning and social coordination. Of course, we're going to have, that filtering thing I showed you before, that's going to have to be involved in it, but I'm less interested in our particular conceptions and how they work individually, and I'm more interested in these broad social meanings. Okay, so given this, let's think about forms of conceptual amelioration. Now, it's possible sometimes to get disoriented. Suppose I'm looking for a coffee shop in a foreign city and I use Google Maps and I'm directed to a shop that is not what I expected. And so I'm disoriented. There are two different ways that I might be directed to a shop that is not what I expected. One is that I might end up being directed to a truck. And I think, whoa, I wasn't wanting to go to a truck. I mean, it might be coming at it from the other side. And I go, why am I being directed at this truck? This isn't a coffee shop, whatever. But then I go around and I see they're making coffee out the back. Or I might be in Amsterdam. And in Amsterdam, pot shops are called coffee shops, right? And I go, whoa, I was expecting to go to a coffee shop. I wasn't trying to go to a pot shop. And so there are a couple of different things that might be going on when you're disoriented. One is that you might find that there is a region of possible space in the partition of coffee shops where they had trucks that were coffee shops that you never imagined, right? You went, whoa, that's a part of possible, coffee shop space that I had never imagined before. But whoa, there I am, and there it is. I've learned something new about the coffee shop space. Another thing you might find is that what you come across is a pot shop, and the pot shop is outside of what anyone would naturally consider a coffee shop. In dominant English, American, Australian usage. And then the question is, whoa, do I include this now in coffee shops or I don't include it in coffee shops? How do I want to think about this? Do I want to extend what we consider coffee shops to include pot shops or not? That's a different kind of disorientation than sort of noticing something that was at a different part of a logical space that you hadn't been thinking about before. Okay, so where do you put it? There's the partitioning and you don't know where to put it. Do you move that coffee shop over or not? And so similarly, there are going to be two different ways we might think about amelioration. When you're thinking about the truck, this is going to be epistemic amelioration. You're learning more about that partition of logical space. There are things in it that you hadn't imagined. There are things in it that you've never considered before. Because of course, we are always focused on only parts of it. We don't, this is a kind of Wittgensteinian point perhaps, but it's, a point about how there are going to be possible scenarios that the ordinary person has never imagined, even the philosopher has never imagined. And we have to explore the logical space of our concepts. But there are going to be times also when we have to wonder, whoa, have we got this right? And I'm going to come to that next. That's the semantic. So in epistemic, we improve our understanding of the informational content of the concept. We might refine it. We might refine our concept based on a broader or deeper knowledge of the phenomenon by gaining empirical knowledge, undertaking conceptual genealogy, or developing insight into logical space at a more fine-grained resolution, or through experiential access. We might improve our access to the informational content by gaining more reliable or illuminating access by different modes of presentation. So yes, you think about water, but there are many people who've never experienced snow, maybe never experienced ice. And so, oh my gosh, they come to see a new form of what water might be by actually experiencing the coldness of snow and ice. And the semantic amelioration, we change what partition of logical space the term or the concept represents. So we might improve the resources available to track truths. We might discover that race is associated socio-historical kind. So it might be that, so in the case of whites and non-whites, there are people who thought at one point that to be white, you had to have a white race gene, right? And if that's true, then there are no whites, or no white people, because none of us have a white race gene. Everything is non-whites. There's not even a possibility, let's say, let's imagine for the moment, there's not even a possibility of such a gene. But once we see that race is a socio-historical kind, then we can begin to draw different kinds of distinctions between people. And this is going to be a way of ameliorating, right? Okay, so I'm not suggesting that this is necessarily the right picture of what it was that the race theorist is doing, whether the race theorist is doing epistemic or semantic amelioration, but from the point of view of people who think that it was part of the concept of race, that we were biologically raced or genetically raced, that it was in our bodies, it was written in our bodies what race we were, then it's going to seem that the socio-historical analysis is changing the subject, right? We've changed the extension, we've changed what race is, so to speak. And so what we have to think about is, well, is that the right way to think about, changing the intention of race? Is that the right way to think about it, or white? And if so, have we just changed the subject matter? Just talking about something else, and we're not talking about the same thing. Believe me, I know. I mean, I give a socio-historical analysis of race, and there are many people who are the anti-realists about race who think, yeah, fine, but you're not speaking English anymore. You're speaking made-up Haslanger talk, which I don't think is true. So the alethic one, the pragmatic one, what we mean can affect what we do. So what there is to track, changing the terms of coordination may be practical. So lunch was once a light meal at any time of day or night. It became useful to be able to predict what time of day or night when someone asked you to lunch. And so now lunch is in the middle of the day sometime. And moral, surely our concepts can affect our moral orientation, what's morally salient. And so there too, we might want to make a change in what is included. So same-sex marriage, for example. Okay, so the problem, content is king. Isn't content essential to what a concept is, to the identity conditions for concepts? How is semantic amelioration possible? Well, if informational content is essential to a concept, then semantic amelioration is impossible, and the best we could hope for is concept replacement. Concept replacement is, of course, compatible with retaining the word for new content, so replacement could be masked, and I think that this is sometimes fine. It's not, but as I said at the beginning, in that short section at the beginning about when we use the term marriage or woman in new ways, for example, women to include trans women in marriage, to include same-sex marriage, then there's this question, well, you're just changing the term and masking it, and this is like illegitimate. I feel like, yeah, you could go that way, but my view is that no, we shouldn't go that way. I believe that, and I'm not going to defend this about marriage in particular, but I think there are certainly cases that can be characterized this way, that in the case of marriage, I think that marriage was assumed in the West to be between one man and one woman, that was part of what marriage meant. But I think that has changed, but I think we haven't replaced the concept. Okay, so concepts provide us with orientations toward logical space, and so they should be dispositions that are apt for the content, because we want to be disposed to act appropriately toward the content, but they also need to be apt for the function they serve in coordination. So here's an example that I include in the paper. It's the concept of the meter. So suppose we succeed in fixing the referent of meter using a stick. let's say the stick that happens to be exactly 39 inches long, just for the purposes of the example, but using the physical object as a standard is a nuisance because it doesn't enable us to achieve the uniformity of measure that's required. It changes depending on the barometric pressure and the humidity and all those sorts of things. And not everyone all over the world can go see the stick and use it, etc. So it's reasonable to correct ourselves and to correct what we mean by meter. We might find that there's a distinctive physical phenomenon that's close in length to 39.37, etc., etc., and we change the length of the meter to that. Now, I believe that in such cases, we're not changing the concept of meter. The concept of meter was introduced to perform a certain function. And what we're trying to do is get closer to something that enables us to serve that function. This initial length that we suggested didn't work, and so we corrected it. We made it better. And so different things count as a meter long now. So concepts are not simply cognitive placeholders for content. They provide orientations toward content at different levels of granularity, highlighting features of the content in response to questions, situate the content in different subject matters, and mandate a cluster of inferential effective responses. This is why we introduced the notion of concepts in addition to content, right? We thought, I mean, this is like the whole problem for the externalist is that you can't do everything with just content, informational content. You need something else. And so we introduced the notion of concept to provide us this orientation that you have to the content. So those aspects of concept should carry weight in individuation. If we just use concepts and we say, well, concepts are individuated by their content, then it's not clear why we introduced them in the first place. It's sometimes more important to the individuation of a concept that it be included in a particular subject matter and embedded in the relevant set of practices than that it maintain its exact informational content. And in these cases, we should say that a change of content is compatible with the continuity of the concept. So here's, remember Yolson, beverages and chemicals, and things go really bad. And we might want to switch chemicals and beverages, right? We want to move water to go with beverages rather than to go with H2O. So the very point of introducing concepts is to do justice to the different ways we access content, our different dispositions to respond, and to ignore these differences in considering the individuation of concepts would be to sacrifice what we have gained. But I'm not going to propose an algorithm to guide us in deciding when and how to ameliorate. And I'm not intentionally, this is important. These decisions are a matter of judgment, and we're sensitive to a broad range of considerations. We have to, when we're thinking, remember thinking about the coffee shop, thinking about, do we include the pot shop as a coffee shop? Well, it's kind of going to depend, right? There's going to be a lot of different considerations, practical, moral, ethic, et cetera, when we're trying tradition, history, geography, all of these sorts of things are going to be relevant when we're trying to figure out whether we semantically ameliorate. So we encountered these questions not just as theorists, not just as scientists, but as agents engaged in historically specific practices. The question is how we should go on, how we collectively, in our efforts to coordinate with each other, how we should go on, and there's not going to be a rule to tell us how. Okay. Systems approach to function. So I keep talking about how the concept functions. And another thing that Kaplan has argued about is, well, concepts don't have a function. I don't know what you mean by concepts having a function, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's important to note that I'm not doing teleosemantics here. I have a different notion of function that comes out of a kind of Cummins style theory of functions. It's a systems approach. So in some cases of amelioration, we should look to the function of a concept, the function of it in our coordination system to determine how to proceed. What function does this concept serve? I'm not claiming that we construct concepts with purposes in mind, or that concepts have a proper function. I'm not claiming also that all concepts are functional concepts, like carburetor, right? That's about the content. The content of the notion of a carburetor is functional. The carburetors function in a certain way in engines, right? That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about how these orientations that we take up toward partitions of logical space, how they play a role in social systems. I'm relying on a systems conception of function rather than a purposive or ideological conception. So according to a systems approach, and the classic text is Cummins, and that's in the bibliography on the handout, features of a system, an engine, a circulatory system, are explained by the workings of its subparts, the carburetor or the heart. We decide on what system and what features of the system we're interested in. And the same thing can function differently with respect to different systems. We can consider how a school functions within an educational system or within a neighborhood or within a state. So we needn't say that the part in question has a proper function. So here's a school. In the educational system, it serves as a springboard for entrance into Princeton or wherever there's students and teachers, anyway, all of that. It has a particular role there. Within the neighborhood, it functions as a site where families meet because they take their children to the playground. It can serve voting. You can vote in a school, something like that. So it has a particular role in the neighborhood. And it also has a role in a function in the legal and social services system. So you get, in many places, there are police installed in schools and social services. It is, in the United States anyway, schools are an incredibly important place for the distribution of medical care to children, to oversight for child abuse and such like that. Schools have that function in these broader legal and social systems. So the school has multiple functions. And this is what I'm trying to suggest is also true of concepts. So I'm talking about the function of a concept. I'm talking about its role in a social system. So consider the concept of family. The concept of family has a function because we process certain kinds of information for the purpose of coordination. We can judge the adequacy of how we do so by reference to how well the coordination works. Better and worse concepts of family can be evaluated in terms of how having the relevant dispositions to respond to a particular content enables us to achieve coordination around intimacy, child rearing, economic collaboration, etc. So for example, the fact that for a long time people didn't recognize same-sex marriages or same-sex families as families or adoptive families as families, this was a problem for coordination. I mean, I know myself, right? I would go pick up my children who are not the same race that I am, and people would, wonder whether I was their parent and resist releasing them to me. This is a bad concept of family that says that families are biological and so you have to be the same race as your children, because it prevents a certain kind of organization of school life and of medical care, all that kind of stuff. So if we can begin to change our conception of family to be broader, then we're going to do better with coordination. But sometimes epistemic amelioration is not enough. And I think that sometimes we need to modify the content to include same-sex, adoptive families, etc. Oh, I have to tell you this story. It was so great yesterday. My daughter was applying. My daughter's a teacher. She was applying to a job, and I was trying to help her write a description of, a cover letter, and saying yes, and I work well with staff, students, and parents. And I said parents, and she said, no, Mom, families. It's not always parents. And I was going, yes, my daughter. Anyway, so sorry, I had to brag on that a little bit, because it isn't always parents who are responsible for children. Okay, and the moral, the organization of the family is a matter of justice. Should we count as real families only those constituted by heterosexual couples and their biological offspring? I think that our concept should be evaluated with respect to whether it facilitates coordination on morally acceptable terms. Okay, almost done. So note that the partition of logical space that we should be collectively tracking and how we track it may be different from the one we're currently tracking. So think about the meter stick, right? The meter, we weren't currently tracking the one when it was just the stupid stick. This provides a basis for allowing ameliorative accounts to be a way of improving the content of our concepts and not just replacing them. Concepts and orientations are a part of the cultural techne that keep a social system of interdependent practices, institutions, and structures running because they focus our attention on features of the world around which we coordinate, and they call for approved responses. But the approved, that's kind of in scare quotes, of course. If the system is flawed, a concept or a schema or an orientation or social meaning may be a source of the flaw because broad possession of it and action in accord with it entrenches injustice. Okay, conclusion. We have an interest in carving logical space in order to coordinate with each other, to draw distinctions that serve our purposes as social beings, and to realize our values. How best to do this changes as we develop new technologies and as we come to appreciate new and different values. When social change happens, there's likely to be controversy and disagreement about how to extend the concepts we've been using to do the work we now need them to do. Such changes should be acknowledged as such and should not be held hostage to what we thought we were doing all along and simply how to continue that. Our conceptual framework should be forward-looking and give us the tools to envision and create better lives together. Thanks.